So we are in the book of Ruth, and today our passage comes from Ruth chapter 1, and I'm going to read verses 16 through 17, and these are the words of Ruth to her mother-in-law Naomi. Please look at them with me. She says, "Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Friends, this is God's word, and I believe with all my heart that it is true, and that there is something in here for you this morning. You may be seated. For a family in Argentina, their week had gone from bad to worse. It began tragically with the death of a husband and father, Miguel Guzman, who unexpectedly passed away. And so the family mourned his death. They planned his funeral. They laid him in the grave. But the day after his funeral, the day after he was buried, his best friend, his beloved German shepherd named Captain, mysteriously disappeared. And the family just couldn't believe their luck. They were grieving their father, and then all of a sudden his beloved dog goes missing. And so they obviously were sick to their stomachs that Captain was gone. And so they began looking everywhere for this dog, calling neighbors, posting signs, and searching streets, driving all around town, looking for Captain, calling his name. And thankfully, they eventually found him. But where they found him was shocking, to say the least. Captain was over 45 minutes away, loyally looking over the gravesite of his late owner. And the family couldn't believe it, especially because they had never brought the dog to his grave. So there was no way that he could have known from memory where his owner was buried. And especially that far of a distance, it was just miraculous that he found his way there at all. And though the family tried to take Captain back to their home, each time that they brought him home, he would actually break loose again, and he would find his way back to the cemetery, faithfully looking over the tombstone of his master. And so eventually the family just gave up trying to take him back and allowed Captain to live at the cemetery. And so for 12 years, Captain faithfully and loyally stood at guard over his owner's grave up to his dying day. They say that a dog is a man's best friend, but in this case, that friendship went even beyond the grave. You know, there's something profound about loyalty, isn't there? Loyalty, it's what keeps you shopping at the same stores week after week, year after year. Even if prices are better somewhere else, you are just loyal to that store, and so you're going to keep going back no matter what. Loyalty is why you keep cheering for your favorite team season after season, even though each season seems to end in disappointment. Right? It's loyalty. And of course, we all appreciate that friend who you know will be there for you in the good times and in the bad times, no matter what. And as we'll see in our passage today, true loyalty, especially loyalty in the face of adversity, is powerful and even life-changing. Well, we are now on the third week of our series in the book of Ruth. And so if you have a Bible, go ahead and grab it and turn to the book of Ruth. And if you don't have a Bible, there should be a hardback black one in one of the seats in front of you. And in that Bible, Ruth is on page 222, 222. Well, the first week in this series, we laid the groundwork of this book. And we talked about big picture items like the context, how this book was written, its composition, as well as the cast of characters that appear in it as well. And during that conversation, we noted that though Ruth is the main character, the central character is the widow, Naomi. This is a story that's about how God takes the tragedy of Naomi's life and redeems it for his greater purposes. How he brings about her tragic story and brings it to a greater good. But as we saw last week, we can't rush to the happy part of the story without first walking through the tragedy and the death. Because in just the first 9 verses, Naomi encounters tragedy after tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. And by the end of the first chapter, Naomi is just completely devastated. And she's so heartbroken that she makes her tragedy her identity. And she goes as far as to change her name from Naomi, which means sweet, to Mara, meaning bitter. But despite all of this, there is a little glimmer of hope. Because even in the midst of her tragedy, God is at work to provide for her. He has ended the famine in Bethlehem, which allows her to come back, to return home. And all the more, Naomi does not return alone. And it is that part of the story that we are going to get into today. But in order for us to do so, we need to kind of take a step back just for a moment. Because notice verse 4 of Ruth chapter 1. So Elimelech and his family moved to Moab, and he has 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they marry 2 Moabite women. The first, Mahlon, marries a woman named Ruth, and Chilion marries a woman named Oprah. Actually not. I messed up my own joke. Shoot. Orpah is the name of the woman he marries. I was trying to psych myself up. Don't get them confused. I got them confused. Anyway, following the deaths of their father-in-law and both of their husbands, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth are now all widows. And given that there's not much for Naomi in Moab now that all the men in her life are dead, she begins to set off towards her hometown with her daughters-in-law in tow. And this is where we pick up the story. Look at verse 6. Listen to what it says. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went out on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. And the Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." So here we see Naomi's plea for Ruth and Orpah to turn back. Now, something we talked about a couple of weeks ago is that since this book is predominantly dialogue, we often don't get any insight from the narrator as to why people say the things that they do. We don't know their motives behind why they say what they say. So as readers, what we should be doing is we should be questioning and reflecting on why each person says the things they do. So why do you think Naomi is so adamant for her daughters-in-law to leave? What are her motives for asking her daughters-in-law to leave? Well, I think from this text it is reasonable to wonder if Naomi's motives are multifaceted and complex. Because I think there are a couple of motives that we could see here. And the first is that she's certainly doing this from what I would say is a selfless motive. Like Naomi recognizes that she is beyond marrying years, at least in this culture. But Orpah and Ruth still have a legitimate chance to get remarried. And so in her mind, the likelihood of this happening is so much higher if these women remain in Moab. If they go back to their own families and stay among their own people, in their own homeland, they will likely find other Moabite men to marry. And she says to them in verse 8, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." And so Naomi does not selfishly hold on to the only remnant of family that she has left, but she, with open hands, blesses her daughters-in-law and gives them the opportunity to move on. And there's something truly honorable about this, isn't there? Like sometimes people need that. They need the permission to leave. Sometimes a simple blessing for someone to move on makes all the difference. So like maybe for you this looks like blessing your mom. Like you say, "Mom, Dad has been gone for a number of years. And we want to give you the blessing that if you want to get remarried, that's okay. We bless you in that. It's okay. We'll be okay with that." Or maybe as a parent, it's blessing your adult children and saying, "Hey, like, I love you guys, but I know you have a dream of moving to California. I don't know why you want to move there, but you have a dream of pursuing your goals somewhere far away. And I want you to know that though it would break my heart, you have my blessing to move, to go where you need to go." That would be a sacrifice to give that blessing, but it would be selfless. And so Naomi is selflessly giving these women the opportunity to start anew apart from her. Not to feel obligated to carry the burden of caring for her or the hefty prospects of being a widowed woman in a foreign land. And so I think Naomi's selflessness can be praised, but there's also, I think, underneath this a sad sense that she's also doing this from a self-deprecating motive. You can pick it up in verses 11 and 13, because after she gives her initial blessing, her daughters-in-law push back and they say, "Absolutely not. We're not abandoning you, Naomi. We're staying with you." To which Naomi replies with a soliloquy that is steeped in sarcasm. She says, "Look, I have nothing to offer you. I'm old, so I can't get remarried. But even if I got married this very night and successfully consummated the marriage with a pregnancy first try, which at my age is very unlikely, and I had not one but two male children in my womb, would you really stick around for those little babies to be born and then grow up into adult men? Besides, by the time that they were of marrying age, you would be beyond childbearing age." And so her argument is over the top and a bit dramatic, but what's her point? Her point is that in her mind, the only thing that she can offer Orpah and Ruth is no longer there. Her only source of identity and her only source of personal worth, namely being a wife, being a mother, and the hope of being a grandmother, have been stripped away from her. And so in her mind, she no longer has anything to offer them. She now sees herself in this sort of self-deprecating way. And perhaps you can relate to Naomi in some way. Like maybe for you, it was after you lost your job. And you believed that you lost your value as a man. That since you could no longer provide for your family, you felt just worthless. Or maybe it was after your divorce. And you were so filled with shame following the divorce that you could barely look your parents in the eye. Of course, they had been happily married for over 45 years. And so you felt like your dreams of happily ever after had been shattered, and so you felt like you were just a hopeless disappointment to them. Or maybe, like Naomi, it was after the death of someone you loved. You had put so much of your identity in being a mother or father, in being a husband or wife, or being his or her friend, that life seemed to lose its meaning once they passed away. You know, often when tragedies strike your life, you can become so overcome with shame surrounding what has happened to you that you might feel like you've lost all sense of dignity. And when people try to come alongside you and help you, your impulse is to push them away, because you don't want to be a burden to them, right? You don't want to dampen anyone else's day, or you don't think that you're worthy of their concern or worthy of their care. Because the single most difficult thing to do is in the moment that you are suffering, to receive support and care from someone else when you feel like you have absolutely nothing of value to give them in return. And left unchecked, these feelings can cause you to try to refuse the help and to refuse the support that you truly and even desperately need. And it seems that this is what is going on in the mind and the heart of Naomi. But before I move beyond this, there could be one more motivation for Naomi's dismissal of her daughters-in-law. And again, I'm simply trying to kind of read between the lines here, so we can't know this for sure, but there could be perhaps the reality that deep down, Naomi also has a selfish motive for shooing these ladies away. Because it is not out of the question to wonder if Naomi wants them to leave because she doesn't want to be seen in Bethlehem, in Israel, with Moabite daughters-in-law. Because remember, the Israelites and the Moabites are ancient enemies. They don't get along. They hate each other. Specifically, the Israelites hate the Moabites. They had this deep disdain for the people of Moab. Why? Well, on the one hand, you can chalk it up to racism. The Israelites simply believed that they were better than the Moabites. And a key reason for this has to do with how the Moabite people came to be in the first place. If you know their origin story, you know that it is one of the most perverse events recorded in the entire Bible. In Genesis 19, we're told that Abraham's nephew Lot and his two daughters narrowly escape God's judgment on the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so the three of them, they find themselves in the middle of nowhere. And so, in a disturbing turn of events, Lot's daughters, for some delusional reason, decide that their only chance of having kids is to do so by sleeping with their father. And so they get him drunk, and both of them sleep with Lot. And each has a son as a result of this. And one of the boys was named Moab, who would go on to be the patriarch of the Moabites. And so for the Israelites, the Moabites were seen as a defiled and lesser people because of Moab's incestuous conception. But another reason why the Israelites looked down on Moabites was out of a righteous desire to be religiously reclusive. The Moabites were a pagan people, worshiping a variety of gods. And throughout Israel's history, when the Israelite men would marry Moabite women, they too would get sucked up into this idolatry, which always led to some big issues like 24,000 Israelites dying in Numbers 25. And so from experience, the Israelites determined that mingling with Moabite women is not a good idea. And so all this is to say that perhaps Naomi would be ashamed to appear before her Israelite friends with a Moabite daughter-in-law. That's a possibility. And so whether Naomi speaks from a motive of selflessness, self-deprecation, or selfishness, she is telling her daughters-in-law to hit the road. And how do they respond? Well, look at verse 14. It says that they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So Orpah complies. She literally kisses Naomi goodbye. Now, it's important that we, reading this, don't look down on Orpah for making this decision. Like Naomi had blessed her to go, and so she took that blessing and she ran with it. And my guess is that if most of us were in that situation, we would probably do the same thing that Orpah did. But Ruth doesn't comply. Rather, Ruth clings to the garment of Naomi. And this moment is crucial for us as we read this book, because up to this point, we really don't know anything about Ruth. She's only mentioned in passing thus far. We know nothing of her character. We know nothing of her personality. But as we keep reading, she's going to make a very powerful first impression on you and me. So let's pick things up in verse 15. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So Naomi urges Ruth once again to leave. Go home like Orpah has. But Ruth responds in the most beautiful and profound way. Her response is quite poetic. Her words have this like melodic ring to it. In fact, so touching are they that I think you could have these as wedding vows and no one would bat an eye, right? If you took them out of context and said this at a wedding, it would seem very appropriate. They're very beautiful words. But I want you to notice the different parts of Ruth's response to Naomi, why it's so powerful. First, she begins with chastisement or rebuke, a little rebuke of Naomi. She says in verse 16, "Oh, don't urge me to leave you." In other words, cut that out. I'm not going anywhere. You are stuck with me. Ruth confronts what I think are the negative motives behind Naomi's pleading for her to leave. I think Ruth is calling her out in a way and affirming that to her, Naomi's value goes far beyond that which she can provide. Ruth doesn't love Naomi because she was her husband's mother, because he's gone. And Ruth doesn't love Naomi because she could offer her money or protection or another husband, because Naomi can't. She loves Naomi because Naomi is Naomi. In this case, Ruth is living up to her name, which means friendship. Her friendship to Naomi supersedes their devastating circumstances. So Naomi can quit trying to shoo her away. Ruth does not do this harshly, though, but she is forceful in the sense that she isn't backing down. And sometimes people who are hurting need that, especially from their closest friends. Like, obviously, like, people in grief need privacy and space, but when someone is hurting, often what speaks volumes is when true friends ignore that invitation to remain at arm's length and instead embrace their grieving friend with acts of love, whether it be cards, flowers, kind words, or the incredible gift of being present in the midst of pain. It's this kind of resolve that we see on full display in Ruth. And Ruth calls out Naomi's negative talk, but then follows it up with a profound proclamation of commitment. As she continues, "For where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay." Long before social media, Naomi had someone following after her. Ruth isn't going to leave her side, no matter what. And we have to zoom out at the big picture and take in how radical this is for Ruth to say this. Because remember, when does Ruth take place historically? Anybody remember? It's in verse 1 of Ruth 1. In the days that the judges ruled. And what is the mantra of this time in Israel's history? It's Judges 21, verse 25. In those days, there was no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So everyone in this day and age was looking out for their own skin. Nobody was committing themselves to anything besides what benefited themselves. But the mindset that Ruth is displaying here is completely the opposite. While everyone else is indifferent, Ruth is all in. While everyone else is fickle, Ruth is fiercely loyal. While everyone else is indecisive, Ruth is decisive. She is planting her foot. In a world of people who are wishy-washy, Ruth is unwavering. And man, isn't this a message that we need to hear today as well? Like, people today, just like back then, are so afraid of commitment, are so afraid of being tied down, even if it's committing to a good thing. People are afraid of committing to a job. Like, either they will leave that job the moment things get difficult, or they just won't work at all. People are afraid of committing to a relationship, which is why the number of people getting married has been steadily declining. People are even afraid of committing to a single religion or a single belief system, which is why people would rather say that all religions are true, or that your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth, rather than do the hard work of investigating and discovering what the actual truth really is. Because once you know the truth, you got to commit to it. You got to stay with it. But Ruth isn't like this at all. She is loyal. She's committed. And she seals her commitment with a covenant. Because look at how her proclamation ends in verse 17. She says, "May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." Notice what Ruth is doing here. She's gone beyond just making a simple promise between her and Naomi. She's now brought this promise upward. She's invited God into this agreement and arrangement. And especially in this day and age, that was making her commitment officially official. It's making her bit of commitment into a binding covenant. Because a part of a covenant is an expression of the consequences of breaking that covenant. Ruth literally says, "May God curse me if I ever abandon you." Like, that's some pretty serious stuff. But as you can see here, Ruth is a pretty serious young lady. She is adamant. And I want to pause here for a moment, because the temptation for us is to stand back here and to praise Ruth for being so resolute and resilient. And don't get me wrong, Ruth is absolutely an admirable person, to say the least. But I think the loyalty of Ruth needs to point us to something greater, and that is the loyalty of God. You see, in this instance, Ruth is a visual demonstration to Naomi, but also to you and me, of the loyalty and the steadfastness of God. Ruth is modeling God's character, whether she knows it or not. That it's this truth that in your darkest moment, God will never abandon you. That when you need Him the most, God is right there by your side. And we see this all throughout Scripture. In Deuteronomy, God tells all of Israel to be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of your enemies. It is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Through the prophet Isaiah, God says, "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, when you go through difficult times, I will be with you." Or in Psalm 23, David's most famous psalm, he eloquently declares words that you probably know by memory. That even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? Because you are with me. Ruth's clinging to Naomi is a powerful reminder to us that when you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, when you go through the rough waters, when you go through hostile territory, you are not only able to cling to God, but in all reality, God clings to you. He holds on to you in your darkest moments. The covenant commitment of Ruth is a characterization of our Creator's covenant commitment to Christians. Which leads me to one final thing about Ruth's impactful speech. And that is her commitment not only to Naomi, but to God Himself. Through her words, she expresses her real and genuine conversion. Notice verse 16 again. She says, "For where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." Now, I think there's a very deliberate reason why Ruth is professing this faith. And that is she is responding to what Naomi has just said. Naomi says, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." Go back to your gods, Naomi says. Go back to your people. Go back to worshiping the idols that you have served your entire life. But Ruth, in this moment, puts her foot down and says, "Those gods are no longer my gods. Your God is my God. You can't pay me to turn back." And there's a part of me that wonders if Naomi was testing Ruth here. Like by telling her to turn back to her gods, she was trying to see where Ruth really stood on things. Like they had known each other for over 10 years, the text tells us. They had been through a lot together, but what Ruth really believed wasn't apparent to Naomi, it seems. And maybe you, like Ruth, have been on a spiritual journey of sorts. Like maybe you've been investigating this whole Christianity thing for a while, and you're trying to figure out who this Jesus guy really is and how this applies to your life. Or maybe you are a Christian, but you've been wrestling with some deep-seated sin issues, and so you're trying to grow out of them or grow through that. And, you know, the nature of growth in general is that it is gradual, right? It's slow. It takes time. And so if you've been kind of growing in your faith, who you were 10 years ago or even 1 year ago could be drastically different than who you are today because that growth happened gradually, right? And you probably didn't notice it happening, but it was happening. And so I wonder if I were to ask you today to return to that life you lived 10 years ago or that life you lived a year ago, what would you say? Like if I said, go ahead, go back to living for the Friday night high, or go back to worshiping the gods of pleasure and money, or go back to your life before you started coming to church or before you became a Christian, go back to that. What would you do if that opportunity was presented to you? Would you go back? And if presented with the option to go back, if you would say no, my question to you would be, have you, like Ruth, ever made that set-in-stone commitment to Christ? Have you ever declared, like Ruth, that Christ is your God, that Jesus is your God? And if the answer to that question is no, my follow-up question to you is, what's stopping you from going all in? What is preventing you from making a decision today to leave everything else behind and to follow after Jesus? If you're ready to make that commitment, I'd love to talk to you and pray with you. But in the meantime, would you pray with me as we end our time together in worship? Lord God, we thank you for this reminder from your word that you are unwavering in your commitment to us. That through Ruth we see a glimpse of your character. That God, you are with us in the good times and the bad times. That you do not ever leave us stranded, you do not ever leave us alone, but that you are with us. God, remind us of that this week. And God, I just pray that if anyone here has been on this journey, whether it's overcoming a sin issue in their life or growing deeper in their faith or maybe just investigating Christianity, God, I just pray that they would be able to this day make a commitment to you. That they would put their foot in the sand and say, hey, I'm not going back. I want to follow you. God, I pray that you would help all of us, though, to renew a commitment to you, to remind ourselves of the call to follow after you, to leave everything else behind, and to strive for what's ahead, to strive for you. And God, we do love you, and we praise you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.